All right, so welcome back. This is part two of our lecture on carbohydrates. And just got to say, I'm excited. I love carbohydrates, not just to eat. I think they're a very fascinating type of chemical structure and group of biological molecules. I may not have mentioned this in class, but some of my background research involves the bacterial cell wall, which is a carbohydrate. So it's something I know quite a bit about. So today we are going to continue talking about carbohydrates. We're going to focus a little bit more on some things we haven't talked about. So the body's use and diabetes and sugars and artificial sugars and things like that. So back to glucose, of course. So we mentioned before that glucose is, of course, an essential molecule for the body. And it's actually the only energy that certain cells in your brain can use, and your red blood cells, and certain parts of the nervous system. So there is a recommended minimum that we get 130 grams per day, and that's kind of just a very basic level. The recommended intake is actually a little bit higher for just kind of normal functioning, particularly if you're doing any working out or athletics or any physical activity. Glucose is very, very important. Of course, some people starve by choice, whether it's fasting or by involuntary starvation. And our body can make some glucose out of protein. And so this unfortunately does break down your immune cells and your protein in your muscles. And so that's a huge disadvantage of starving and fasting, in that you're breaking down muscle mass. But it's essential, like I said, for the brain, in order to function properly, has to have some glucose. This is just a scheme showing the breakdown of glucose. If you've done any biology courses, you might be familiar with cellular respiration. You've got the glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, all of those kind of things. And really, this is just showing that glucose gets broken down into smaller molecules, and what we end up with is two byproducts. Energy, of course, that's the thing that we want, and the other thing is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is represented by its chemical structure CO2, and that gets expelled when we breathe out of our lungs. And if we consume too much glucose or excess glucose, we can use it to make other biological molecules, not necessarily directly from glucose directly, but from some of the intermediates that you'd find in there, pyruvate and acetyl-CoA, and molecules like that can be used to build amino acids. Amino acids are used to build proteins, and any surplus after that is used to form fats, and those are going to get stored on our body. Our body is very good at storing fats. Let's talk a little bit about what happens if we don't get enough carbohydrates in our diet. This can induce a process called ketosis. And you may have heard of ketosis because, of course, the keto diet is a really popular thing nowadays, and I'll comment on that in a moment. But basically, ketosis is when we don't have enough carbohydrates. If you take a look at the top part of this image, you can see it's talking about when we have enough carbohydrates, and we have the pancreas produces insulin that helps our cells to, of course, take that glucose and use it as energy. When we don't have glucose in the blood, our body will actually start to use fats, which is not really a bad thing. In fact, we do this all the time. If it's been a long time since we've had a meal, if you are doing some aerobic exercise, your body will use fats as well as part of the whole metabolic process there. But during the breakdown of fats, we get a type of compound called ketones. And so that's where the word ketosis comes from. Now, there are some dangers with ketosis if somebody does it for too long, or if concentration of these ketones are too high, because actually what they do is they will actually form acids in the blood, and there are actually some dangers with chronic ketosis. And you can see a big list of things there, like vitamin and mineral deficiencies, loss of bone minerals, kidney stone risk, those kind of things. And in some cases, what you're looking at is a metabolic emergency for some of these people who do this. And with the ketosis diet, or the ketogenic diet, or keto diet, goes by a bunch of names. It was originally developed for people with seizures, and to treat people with severe diabetes, because of course what you're doing is removing a lot of carbohydrates from your diet, which is affecting both the brain and the pancreas, depending on whether it's for seizures or diabetes. And trying to do it carefully so that you're not going to get to a point where it's damaging. And there's kind of a side effect of this, is a lot of people, at least in the short term, will lose weight. And so this has become the kind of the scheme behind a whole bunch of diets that have been out there. The Atkins diet, the more famous one nowadays, is called the keto diet or the ketogenic diet. Super popular for weight loss. And I think on the next slide, I'll comment on that a little bit. A couple of things I want to say about the keto diet. So usually the whole idea behind the keto diet is reducing the carbohydrates in your diet to, I think it's something about 5% or less, and about 90% of your diet is from fat. Generally, that's not a good idea to eat that much fat. It is very successful in helping people to lose weight in the short term. The long-term effects of that kind of diet are not really well understood, other than we have lots of good data to show that you should not be eating that much fat in the long term for cardiovascular disease and whatnot. The other thing to say about these keto diets is a lot of the keto websites and those kind of things don't really explain it biochemically very well. They seem to want to distinguish ketosis from ketoacidosis and all those and kind of make some distinctions in there in terms of trying to get you to do it properly and all that. And I can't really comment on this since I've never done a keto diet, and I've only read a little bit about it. But from what I have read is that not everything is completely clear around it. And probably a lot of people are losing weight because what you're doing is going on a diet, and the diet is telling you to restrict the junk food. And for many people, that is actually one of the most effective things they can do, is cut out a lot of simple and refined sugars. So cut out the soda, cut out the donuts, and those kind of things. And actually, that for a lot of people, that will do wonders in terms of their health and losing weight. So I'm not going to say too much more about this. I'll probably come back to it later on in the semester. But like I said, beware of some of the misinformation out there. And I really do wonder in terms of the long-term effects of it's kind of going against everything that good dietary science is saying to cut down on the fats. Like I said, there's different models of these keto diets. There's sort of dirty keto diets that are eating a lot of, people are just binging on bacon and things like that. And there's more healthy keto diets where they're eating avocados and things like that. So again, it's not all bad. Cutting out the saturated fats and cutting out the junk food is going to do most of us actually a lot of good for our health. So I want to talk a little bit about glucose usage and storage and whatnot. I have got a graphic from the textbook on the next slide, but I just want to take a couple of notes first in terms of what is happening when we eat carbohydrates, right? So that's going to be the first thing here, is going to say we're going to eat food. And then what happens? Well, what happens if the food has carbohydrates is that it is going to cause our blood glucose to rise. Blood glucose rises. So then the question is, what happens at that point? We want to talk about some hormones, but what happens is that this stimulates your pancreas. So your pancreas is an organ, of course, that makes all sorts of enzymes and hormones and things like that. Stimulates your pancreas, and this is going to release insulin. So insulin is a hormone protein, and like I said, it's released when the pancreas detects that you have high blood glucose. So what does insulin do? So insulin basically tells the cells to take up glucose. So cells take up glucose. So they take the glucose out of the blood, and then what happens? Well, a lot of your cells just use the glucose as energy, but in terms of storage, so maybe I'll put that, cells use glucose as energy. There we go. But what else happens? Well, your liver is a major site of glucose storage. So your liver stores glucose as glycogen. Can't spell glycogen today. Let's try that again. We have energy, we have glycogen, and your liver, of course, has a capacity in terms of how much it can store. So any excess gets converted to fat. So it converts excess to fat. There we go. And the last thing that happens with your glucose is that your muscles can store some glycogen, right? So muscles store as glycogen. So it really depends on how much you already have stored up. And if you have excess, like I said, your body will very happily turn that into fat, which is, of course, what a lot of people don't want. But it's really not a bad thing. If you think about what's going on all day, how often do you eat? Often it's 6 hours or more between when we eat our meals, and our fat, or our body is storing things behind. If you also look at kind of historical and prehistorical humans, many people were going a couple of days without eating. A lot of farmers would be starving based on the seasons, and most people, a big challenge for humans historically was actually getting enough calories in your diet. So storing things as fat was actually a good thing. So on the other side, let's talk about what happens when you have not eaten recently. So have not eaten recently. So in this case, your blood glucose is dropping. So blood glucose drops. Okay, so what happens when your body detects a drop in your blood glucose? This actually stimulates the pancreas to release a different hormone. Stimulates pancreas. And this hormone is called glucagon. Kind of a cool name, really. Glucagon. There we go. So insulin is when your blood glucose spikes, and glucagon is when your blood glucose drops. So when your blood glucose drops, this basically tells your liver to, let's break down some glycogen. So your liver cells break down glycogen, and then they release glucose into the blood. So, and release glucose into blood. So that's basically what is happening here. So it's kind of important for you to know basically what insulin and glucagon do. And you can see insulin is stimulating glucose to be taken up by the cells. The liver has a couple of roles, and the rest of the cells can either store it or just basically use the glucose directly. Here's the picture from the textbook. It's a little bit more advanced. You can see a little bit more details in there, but if you take a look here up at number 1, we have the intestine absorbing the glucose there, and down here in the middle we have that pancreas at number 2. It's releasing insulin. The insulin is telling your cells, and there's not just the liver and muscle to take up glucose, but the liver and muscle cells can take up the most amount of glucose. And here's our liver right here at number 3, converting some of it into fat, and these little granules in the middle are supposed to be glycogen. And there's your muscle cells converting it into glycogen for use for later. And on the right, of course, is when the glucose levels decrease. And in this case here, we have glucagon being secreted into the blood, tells the liver to break down the glycogen and bring the levels up in the blood. And so this way your brain is happy and it's getting enough glucose, and same thing with the rest of your cells in your body. So let's just talk a little bit about that excess glucose for a minute. I guess I kind of covered some of this already, what happens with the excess glucose, but it's worth it to think a little bit about other nutrients that are also in the bloodstream. So your cells, they love glucose. Glucose is the molecule of choice for your cells. So if there's a sufficient amount of glucose in the blood, then they are going to ignore the fats, basically is what is happening here. So any fats in the bloodstream are going to be picked up, and your body will happily store that in your fat tissue. So that's number 1. Number 2, Excess glucose converted to fats, we already talked about that. And of course, they are going to be stored in your fat tissues. Some of the extra fat will also be stored in your liver as well, depending on how much is there, particularly if you have a really high concentration of sugars. And like I said, particularly fructose, for some reason, likes to accumulate in the liver. The fat cells will also take up glucose and happily convert it to fat. Apparently, that's a really easy biochemical pathway for your cells to do. So unfortunately, our bodies are really good at doing that, and they can store basically apparently unlimited quantities, just massive amounts. As you probably know, there are some very big people out there who have a lot stored in their tissues. So here's a little diagram here on the right. You can see you've got all of these food groups. You've got the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins, and they all get broken down, and they can all get stored right here as fat. Not all fat is stored in the gut, and we'll talk about different types of fat a little bit later on in the semester. So let's just, I was going to switch to food here, I think, for a minute and kind of talk about carbohydrates and foods. But you can see this note here. It says basically what we've been saying already earlier on in this lecture is that eating complex carbohydrates is much better than eating simple carbohydrates. When you eat sugars and drinks, your blood glucose can spike, and it basically affects your body by asking it to store that extra sugar. Whereas if you have starch and fiber in your diet and a little bit of protein and fat, your digestion is a lot slower. And that's kind of what you want, is that sustained release of glucose into the blood after a meal, rather than the huge spike that you might get after having a really sugary meal. So that's kind of the ideal way to eat. So you may have heard of these terms here: glycemic response, glycemic index, and glycemic load. So let's talk about these. These are, by the way, often used by diabetics to try to understand, what effect different foods they're going to have on their blood glucose and insulin levels. And I'll show you some examples of numbers for these foods here in a moment. So the glycemic response is basically that effect of that food is going to have on your blood glucose levels. The index is very closely related to the response, but it's a scale that's been developed that basically ranks everything, and they rank everything based on basically pure sugar, and which I mean by sugar I mean sucrose and white bread. And I'll show you some examples here in a moment. The glycemic load is basically you're multiplying the quality of the carbohydrate of a given food by the grams of carbohydrate. And so, like I said, these are used by diabetics in many cases, and most people will talk about the glycemic index versus the other two factors there. So I'll show you some numbers. As I mentioned, white bread is kind of the index, and so white bread and also sucrose are basically ranked as 100. So they will raise your blood glucose levels quite significantly. And then everything else on this list, I think actually it looks like a white bagel is a bit higher than 100. But for the most part, diabetics, they're looking at getting low glycemic index foods. Otherwise, they may need insulin or may feel dizzy after eating a meal because of it's affecting them in different ways. But you'll see all sorts of charts like this that talk about glycemic index. And like I said, they're usually targeted towards diabetics. Here's another list, right? So you can see it's saying, hey, take the ones on the left, so sweet potatoes and beans and oatmeal, and then avoid the ones on the right if you're a diabetic. Now there are cases where people may wish to eat, and actually is desired to eat, high glycemic index foods, particularly if you're an athlete and you need to eat something 20 minutes before a game or something. Then you want something that will digest really quickly and give you that energy. And so in that case, and honestly, in many cases after a workout as well, to replenish the glycogen that you've used up while you were working out. We'll talk about working out a little bit later on in this lecture. So this is just kind of a graphic showing the glycemic index. So you can see the red one here is a high glycemic index food. So it breaks down and enters the blood really quickly and causes that sugar spike, whereas a low glycemic index food will be digested and take a couple of hours in order to do so. So it's the diabetics in particular that are concerned about the insulin spikes. If you take a look in the textbook, it has one of these charts here, and I've seen these before. They're for diabetics. I haven't really taken a very good look at it in terms of how to fill these things out, but this is the type of scheme a diabetic might be looking at in order to try to understand how the food they're eating is going to affect their blood glucose levels. I'm not going to dwell on this. Like I said, there's all sorts of schemes and apps and all sorts of other things now to help diabetics with these kind of things. Because many diabetics are not taking insulin, by the way, and we'll talk about diabetes here shortly. Many diabetics are just trying to control their blood glucose by simply having a good diet. So let's talk about diabetes. Diabetes is a number of diseases, and they're all characterized around basically elevated blood glucose levels, and usually something around insulin. It's either inadequate or your body's not responding to insulin properly. It's the amount of diabetes in Canada and developed countries is increasing quite dramatically. I was trying to look up some numbers. Apparently, Diabetes Canada says there's about 2.3 million people with diabetes, and one in three Canadians, I just cannot believe that, apparently have diabetes and don't know it, or they have pre-diabetes. Kind of mind-blowing, although I have met a number of people that I suspect and I wonder whether they are pre-diabetic, partly due to being overweight. And we'll talk about diabetes and weight here in a moment. You may have heard there's different kinds of diabetes. The three most common types are type 1, type 2, and gestational. We'll talk about gestational diabetes when we get to the chapter on pregnancy. Today, we're going to just focus on type 1 and type 2, which are far the most common types. You may wonder, what does diabetes do to you if you have high blood glucose levels? A whole bunch of things. In the short term, you're looking at fatigue, increased urination. Sometimes it affects people's weight, and often diabetics, characteristically, when people are not knowing they're diabetic, they have an intense hunger and thirst and those kind of things. Longer term, you're looking at damage to cardiovascular system, slow healing wounds, those kind of things. Some people get chronic kidney disease, damage to nerves and eyes, and those kind of things. So obviously this is not very good. If you're concerned, whether some of these things fit you, I encourage you to check out that link on the right. That's from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And it's basically a questionnaire that asks you a bunch of questions about your gender and your age and your height and your weight and some of your other habits to assess your diabetes risk. And it's certainly worth taking a look at. And we'll talk about risks here in a moment. So let's just kind of compare type 1 and type 2 diabetes here for a moment. So type 1 diabetes is considered more of a genetic autoimmune disorder. Some people are genetically predisposed to getting type 1 diabetes, so its usually onset is in childhood. Although increasingly more nowadays, we're starting to see more people in midlife, and that may have to do with just poor nutritional and physical health habits, unfortunately, are somehow causing it to onset. But generally, you're looking at childhood. I think the average age is somewhere around 7 or 8. I'm not sure. I have to look that up. So these people usually have kind of an average body fatness, and that'll be important when we talk about type 2 diabetes. And this is about maybe, I think if I remember correctly, I was reading this is about 5 to 10% of diabetes cases. So type 1 diabetes is where it's a problem basically with your pancreas. So it's an autoimmune disease of the pancreas. And so your pancreas is not making enough, or it's not making any insulin. And so these are the people that require the insulin shot. And that's kind of the main area of treatment. So these are the people that would be checking their blood glucose by pricking their finger. Sometimes there's the insulin pumps that they have hidden under their clothing, those kind of things. And it can range from being relatively mild to relatively severe. Often it's the long-term health effects that are the biggest concern, particularly if people are not taking care of their body and gain weight in the long run. Type 2 diabetes is the most common. So this is somewhere around 85% or more, maybe 90%, something like that, if I read if I remember the numbers correctly. And this is often the adult set type diabetes, they used to call it, but it's getting more and more kids are getting type 2 diabetes, in their teen years or prepubescent years. It's getting way more common. So I think that term is going to go away from this. So in this case here, the biggest risk factor is this here, basically body fatness. And we'll talk about that here in a moment, what is going on with that. And with body fatness, unfortunately, comes resistance to insulin. So the pancreas makes insulin, but unfortunately, the cells don't seem to be responding to it as effectively as usual. So usually we're not talking about insulin shots. Usually we're talking about trying to treat the person by having a good diet, sometimes drugs that stimulate the pancreas to secrete more insulin. Once in a while, these people do have to take insulin shots and those kind of things. But generally, the treatment is trying to encourage people to maintain a healthy body weight and consume, a good diet around vegetables, fruit, fish, poultry, those kind of things. And it's really important for these people to restrict alcohol as well. So let's just talk a little bit about type 2 diabetes and weight. Not everything is really fully understood about this, but you can see that there's a little bit of a cycle going on here, right? So you can see if you start here at the beginning of the cycle, it's talking about, okay, someone's obese. So what does that really matter? Well, for some reason, it seems that elevated lipids in the blood cause cells to be insulin resistant. Not something I know a ton about. And like I said, my understanding is that we don't fully understand what is going on here. But it is very tightly linked with obesity. And so your body's not taking in the glucose properly, your glucose blood levels spike, and what happens is it's kind of cyclic in that blood glucose gets converted to fat by fat cells or liver cells, and a person gains more weight. So it's a bit of a cycle. Hopefully I'll learn a little bit more about this someday, but this is, like I said, the number one indicator risk factor of type 2 diabetes is obesity. So sometimes you may hear about people being pre-diabetic. And so pre-diabetic means that their doctor or healthcare professional has determined that their blood glucose levels are higher than normal, but not really considered diabetic yet. So apparently, like I said, a lot of people in Canada fit this category, and partly it has to do with body weight, and less to do with, believe it or not, glucose consumption for some reason. And like something I don't fully understand the metabolism behind that. You may have also heard of this term metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome, you can see, is really just a cluster of different symptoms that include prediabetes, so blood glucose being higher. It also includes excess abdominal obesity, so being fat around the midsection, high blood triglycerides, high blood fats, and low high density lipoprotein. That's the good cholesterol, right? So if you have 3 of 5, often they're talking about people being having metabolic syndrome, and sometimes it's used sort of interchangeably with prediabetes, although metabolic syndrome is technically worse because it means you usually have a couple more conditions. Both of these things mean you're at risk in the future of getting type 2 diabetes and, of course, cardiovascular diseases. So as I mentioned, usually with diabetes, type 2 anyway, the goal is to manage it by trying to encourage the person to lose weight, and mostly controlled by diet, right? So not having intake of added sugars, and trying to get lots of fiber in their diet, and getting the not eating a lot of high glycemic index foods. Physical activity, always a good thing. And in fact, some people who are type 2 diabetic can actually reverse it by losing weight and getting physically active. And so usually that's also part of the management of type 2 diabetes. So that's enough about diabetes for now. We'll probably come back and talk about it here and there a couple of other times. There are a number of other conditions around blood glucose. Another one that's not quite as common is something called hypoglycemia. So hypoglycemia actually means low blood glucose. And there's a bunch of different conditions that will cause this. There's a few genetic disorders. Some of them are malnutrition or alcohol abuse. Sometimes it's poorly managed diet for diabetics. And like I said, a whole plethora of causes of that. And I'm not going to get into that. I think you can read about it in the textbook. There's more details on that, but you may have heard of this condition. These people often feel tired and they carry around candy. And when they feel tired, they pop a candy in order to bring their blood glucose up. So I thought I had a slide here that was talking about sugar and sugar and diabetes. And there are actually a lot of studies on this kind of thing. And of course, if people do eat too much sugar, they do, it can lead to excess calorie consumption, which can lead to obesity, which can lead to diabetes. But there's a lot of studies that show that sugar itself does not necessarily cause obesity. And there's, like I said, a lot of studies that show that kind of thing, and it really does have more or less to do with the actual calorie count. And in many people, that is the case. They are consuming too much sugar, and that is leading to excess calories and leading to obesity, which can lead to diabetes. But sugar itself is not, and sugar consumption itself is actually not an indicator for type 2 diabetes. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about food here for a few minutes in terms of where we're going to get our carbohydrates. So just a quick reminder, we have our two types. We have our complex carbohydrates and our simple carbohydrates, which is our sugar. And so where are we going to get these carbohydrates from? Well, one area of food is, of course, our grains. Our whole grain foods are better because they have more fiber and more vitamins in them. And these things here usually are anywhere from about 35 to 75% carbohydrates. Kind of depends on the grain. Rice, for example, tends to be on the higher end of being loaded with starch. Some other grains, like I'm thinking of like sesame seeds and things like that, tend to be a little higher in fat as well. And good thing is the good kind of fats that are usually found in seeds. Fruits and vegetables, of course, are almost completely carbohydrates, including all three types, so starch and fiber and the simple sugars, and the amount will vary hugely, right? If you look at something like a strawberry has a lot of fructose in it and a lot less starch, but a decent amount of fiber. Something like celery or broccoli has a lot more starch and fiber in it and so on. And you have to kind of look those things up, but these are the things we're trying to get more in our diet. And most people are not spiking their glucose in their blood from eating too much fruit. It's pretty hard to do. Maybe if you ate an entire bag of cherries, that might do it. Most people can't eat that much fruit and spike the blood glucose a lot by eating natural foods anyway. Fruits, I guess I've already talked about fruits a little bit. And one of the big things to say about fruit is it's much better to eat the fruit than to drink the juice. Most fruit juice has added sugars and missing some of the fibers and other benefits, the phytochemicals that you're going to get in the skins and whatnot. And those are the things we're trying to get. Always take a look at juice. There's a lot out there. They're advertising as no added sugars, but take a look at how much sugar is actually in it, because no added sugars doesn't mean it doesn't have a lot of sugar in it. It just means they didn't add any. As for protein-based foods, meats really don't have any carbohydrates in them. I mean, there's a little bit of glycogen in meats, but it's almost not even worth it to count. Plant-based protein foods will vary. Nuts, for example, will sometimes have a little bit of starch in there and a little bit of fiber. Kind of depends on the kind of nut or seed. Beans, of course, are pretty good. They have both starch, fiber, and protein in it. So beans in some ways are a really great type of food to have. There's one exception with animal products that actually has carbohydrate in it, and that is milk products. Milk products have lactose. So we talked about lactose already as being a simple carbohydrate. It's made of glucose and galactose. And so some people are trying to avoid lactose and some people don't really care. But it is a sweetener, and it is something that we'll talk about this in a moment. Lactose will actually promote bacteria in the mouth to cause tooth rot. So we'll talk about dental issues here in a moment. So let's just kind of switch and talk about sugars for a couple of minutes. And by sugars, I mean the simple carbohydrates and the ones that are either monosaccharides or disaccharides. So the ones we talked about before were glucose, fructose, galactose, maltose, lactose, and sucrose. So this is the thing that is not bad on itself, but many of us consume way too much of this. So you can see these recommendations that we try to have 25% or less of our calories from sugars. That's a lot of sugar. The World Health Organization, Canadian Diabetes Association is telling people, let's cut that down to 10%. Let's aim for 5% is really what they're telling you to go for. Now, one thing, as I've stressed a couple of times, we can talk about naturally occurring sugars or added sugars, and they're the same thing. If you're eating a fruit and it has sucrose in it, it's the same as the sucrose that could be added. Now, that being said, right, in terms of the food industry, they do make a distinction between naturally occurring sugars and added sugars, because added sugars have to be included in the ingredients, of course. And they're added for all sorts of things. They make things taste good. They can help brown baked goods and so on. And of course, when things taste good, we're more likely to eat a lot more of it. But sugar is sugar. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. Mostly these sugars are going to be glucose or fructose or sucrose, and in all of these things. If you take a look, I was amazed. I was going through the grocery store in the baking section, and the amount of different types of sugars that are out there, and many of them, have a little stamp on them that says natural, and they're claiming it's healthier for you, and all these kind of things. I've noticed this agave syrup is really a popular thing for some recipes now, and it's basically complete fructose. And honey is sucrose, and also has a lot of fructose and sometimes glucose in it. And actually honey, gram for gram, has more calories than regular sugar. So again, don't eat a pound of honey in one sitting. I'm not sure what is in maple syrup. I think it was glucose, but I'd have to look that one up. But all these things, it's the same stuff. Glucose, fructose, and sucrose is just in all of these products. And if don't fool yourself and think you're getting a whole bunch of fiber by buying that brown cane sugar. You're not. You're not getting a lot of fiber out of that. You're mostly just getting sugar. This is just from the textbook. It's kind of defining a whole bunch of these things, and you can actually read a bit more detail. You can see maple sugar, for example, it says is mostly sucrose, and so on. So if you're interested in reading more about those things, you can go nuts there. So I love graphs and stats, and I was looking at this is Stats Canada, and the amount of estimated added and free sugar, so total sugar content in these things. So really just looking at this darker brownish bar on all these things, because that's all that matters is the total sugar in things. So you can see desserts and sweets, probably not a surprise. Fruits, I don't like how they have that because it kind of depends on the fruit. Some fruits are high in sugar and some are not. And then baked products and breakfast cereals and fruit juices and those kind of things. You can see there's, where all your sugar is coming from in your diet. Dairy products, not usually much, but again, it kind of depends on what you're eating. If you're eating a fruit on the bottom, yogurt, those tend to have added sugar in them, for example. And always take a look at the labels. Fats and meats and oils and those kind of things, well, those tend to not have any sugar added, but lunch meats can have a little bit of sugar added to them. Here's another graph that's talking about the different types of food groups, right? And you can see on the left is added sugar, free sugar in the middle. But again, the thing I'm looking at is on the right. And so desserts and sweets are number one, followed by fruits, followed by beverages. And those are kind of the three big areas where people are getting added sugars in their diet. Some people from dairy, again, it depends on what you're eating in the dairy category. If it's ice cream and yogurts, it might be more sugar than if you're just eating cheeses, for example. I've stressed this before, just because something says all natural or 100% fruit, as you can see on the one on the right, it doesn't mean it contains less sugars. So this is 2 jams. You can see the one on the left, 7 grams of sugar. They've added corn syrup, sugar, high fructose corn syrup to the whole thing. whereas the one on the right is all just concentrated grape juice and pear juice. And if you look at the number of sugars, it's 8 grams per serving. So don't be fooled by things that say they're all natural. You got to look at the details and see what that means. So how much sugar should we be getting in a day? This is the recommendation for a man, about 9 teaspoons. That's 36 grams. I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. The conversion, by the way, is that 1 teaspoon is about 4 grams. It's not an exact conversion. I thought I had the conversion here somewhere. Let me see here. I do have the conversion. 1 teaspoon is actually, so 1 teaspoon is actually 4.2 grams. So I knew I had that here somewhere. Anyway, you can do the conversion. And to give you an idea, so women, they recommend about 6 teaspoons. And so that's 25 grams. And kids, again, depending on the age, the recommendations for kids ranges, and depending on what you're looking at, from about 4 teaspoons to 6 teaspoons, again, depending on the size of the kid and all those kind of things. Now, these are just ballparks, right? There are bigger men and smaller men, bigger women and smaller women, bigger anybody and smaller anybody, right? And but to give you an idea, I'll show you what that looks like here in a moment. On the right there, you can see it's talking about sugar in processed foods. And something else to consider if you're trying to cut sugar from your diet, how much sugar is added to your ketchup and your soups and those kind of things. And sometimes you'd be surprised. It's added really to almost everything out there. So here's an idea about how much sugar is in something. So one drink here, one soft drink, is about 8 teaspoons of sugar. So remember, a man, the maximum is about 9 teaspoons, and a woman is about 6 teaspoons in a day. So if you're a woman, this is maybe too much sugar that's recommended for you in a day. If you're a man, this is almost the limit. Now, most people drink or consume more sugar than this. In fact, most people in Canada, I was trying to find a good number, I found a couple of numbers. Most people apparently consume double the recommended amount of sugar in a day. So if you go back to this, that would be about 18 teaspoons, I think, is the Canadian average, one of the numbers that I saw. So that's a lot of excess sugar, and may have long-term health effects, of course. I found this infographic here, and I thought this was really fascinating because it's showing, you can see these lines here, right? So woman, 6 teaspoons down there, and a man, 9 teaspoons, and a bunch of popular drinks, right? And so a Red Bull is a little bit more than the 6 teaspoons. And vitamin water, again, I was so shocked to find out how much added sugar was in vitamin water. And not quite as much as a can of soda, but getting there. And then a bunch of these other drinks here. If you get these giant bottles of Coca-Cola or Mountain Dew or whatever, there's actually more sugar in there than you should be consuming in a day. Now, this is all, like I said, relative. You know, people have different body sizes, different activity levels. You know, Powerade, for example, if you are, you know, playing an entire football game or something, that may actually be beneficial and good for you, of course. But just to give you an idea, it is certainly worth it to look at those nutrition fact labels. Oh, there's the number there, 18 teaspoons of sugar daily. So I think I got this from Stats Canada. And so that's it's about 288 calories per day. And that's about 14% of a 2,000 calorie per day diet intake. So remember, the World Health Organization Diabetes Association was recommending no more than 10%. And they tell people to aim towards no more than 5%. So you want some tips on reducing sugar? Read your food labels. Go for fresh fruits to satisfy that sweetness craving. And you know, the fresh fruits are going to give you fiber and vitamins, and going to be much better for you than refined sugars that you might find in a cupcake or a chocolate bar or something like that. For some people, using sugar substitutions may work out well, and there's artificial sugars and different things out there that might work. Some people use applesauce in the recipes to substitute a little bit for sugar and whatnot. And so anyway, some ideas there, right? Even recipes, you can often reduce the sugar apparently by up to 1/3, and many people will not taste the difference. Haven't actually tried that with some of my recipes, but maybe I will next time. Haven't baked something in a long time, actually. The good news is that Canadians are eating less sugar. than 20 years ago, apparently. So that's great. I'm not sure why and whether this is awareness or whatever, but that's certainly good news. We like these kind of trends. So as I mentioned, does sugar cause obesity? And I guess I talked about this before with the diabetes, is that there are lots of population studies and all sorts of studies that they show that added sugars do not necessarily lead to higher degrees of body fatness. It's complicated because, of course, people who are eating excess calories are also likely to have bad habits all around. So they're eating lots of fat, lots of sugar, lots of everything. And it's the excess calories that cause obesity, not just the sugar. That being said, for some people, having sweet things does increase their appetite and causes them to eat excess other things as well. And so, as you can see in my top corner here, it says it's complicated. And it really certainly is when it talks about foods. The other thing, as I mentioned before, with these kind of studies, it's really hard to understand what people have actually been eating in the long term. Asking people about, what they actually ate is very hard. People can't remember. And the studies do show that overweight people actually are more likely to underestimate the amount of sugary treats and other foods that they've eaten. Not sure why that is, whether they're embarrassed or they're more forgetful or they're just really bad at judging how much food they ate. So very, very hard to do that. Another thing, right, about gaining weight, generally as people gain weight, their physical activity levels decline. And like I said, there's a lot of factors in trying to understand obesity. And we will certainly come back and talk about obesity in one of our later units. Does sugar cause type 2 diabetes? I think I already talked about this already. Just to give you the points here, right? Obesity is more closely related to type 2 diabetes than diet. And the high calorie intake can be sugars, but it can be fat. It doesn't really seem to matter what it is. And there's been a bunch of studies that show that diabetics, type 2 diabetics that switch their diets to higher whole grain foods and more fiber actually reduce the risk for type 2 diabetes and remove some of the symptoms. You can see that little chart there on the right showing, the amount of type 2 diabetics amongst different types of diets. So, you can see the vegan is the strict one on the one end and non-vegetarian on the other end. And so there is a correlation between that kind of thing. But vegans tend to be, you don't see as many vegans that are overweight or obese. And often they're they're interested in many aspects of their health, right? In terms of, more of them tend to exercise, etc., those kind of things. So what about heart disease? It's certainly worth it to talk about heart disease a little bit about sugar. Again, saturated fat and obesity are the biggest indicators for heart disease, not sugar. Most people, moderate sugar intakes doesn't seem to affect your blood limit, your blood lipid levels too much. That being said, some people seem to be genetically predisposed to eating sugar and they gain weight a lot easier. At least it gets converted to fat more readily. There's lots of studies done on rats, feeding them with high sucrose diets and those kind of things. And you can see blood vessels getting damaged in these high sucrose diets. But a lot of these rat studies, these rats are eating like double the national average on a weight by weight basis. And so really unrealistic levels. And so trying to, again, translate that to what's going on in humans is very hard to understand. There are some studies in humans where they study them short term with high sugar intake, and they do see, like I said, in some people, an effect on their blood and their blood lipid and cholesterol levels. But there's much still to be understood here about sugar intake and cardiovascular disease. Now, the one area that we do know that sugar intake will affect your health is, of course, dental disease. So this is a little graphic showing you have on your teeth and in your mouth are bacteria. You give them sugar and they will produce acid. And so what happens with acid? Acid will break down your enamel. And that is not what we want. And so, if you have eaten a sugary meal, and you have not cleaned your teeth recently, those bacteria are going to produce that acid and break down your teeth enamel. So some quick dental tips, right? The amount of time the sugar remains on your teeth, the worse it is for your teeth. Of course, there's other variables such as the food's composition or how sticky it is, right? Certain types of candies tend to be really, really sticky. And so generally the recommendations are that, if you've had a sugary meal or sugary drink, at a minimum, rinse your mouth out with a little bit of water. Take a drink of water, rinse it out a little bit. Generally though, that's going to do a lot less than actually scrubbing, right? Those bacteria, they live on plaque. And so a little bit of fluoride toothpaste and flossing is going to do your teeth a wonder. In fact, there's studies that show that brushing your teeth are more effective to prevent dental decay than actually restricting sugary foods. But there is a correlation there. And like I said, kind of the biggest risk factor for eating sugar, of course, is dental disease. What about sugar and behavior? Lots of people seem to think that sugar makes kids hyper. This has not been really supported by the scientific evidence. And if you have kids, you probably know they actually seem more hyper in the days leading up to Halloween than after Halloween. And so it's mostly psychological, right? People get excited around candy. Hey, I still get excited around candy once in a while. So let's talk about sugar substitutes for a few minutes here. There's tons that I could be said about sugar substitutes. First, let's talk about these sugar alcohols. There's a whole bunch of sugar alcohols out there. So an alcohol is a compound that has an OH on it. So if you take a look at these compounds, they have a whole bunch of OHs on them. And that's it. These are not going to get you drunk. They are not the same as ethanol. The ethanol is the ingredient you'd find in alcoholic beverages. It's just a chemical name. And there's a whole bunch of these. You can see there's a list here and some of their approved uses, and they're very good at sweetening things. They have different tastes. Some of them are pretty good tasting, and so on. And they tend to be very low calorie. They're not 0 calories. Notice I didn't say no calorie. I said low calorie. They're very low calorie. They don't usually affect the glycemic response too much. And the good news is the bacteria in your teeth don't seem to be able to use them very effectively. And so they don't seem to contribute to dental disease. You're probably wondering, are there any drawbacks? The biggest drawback is that if you eat too much, you may have some looser stool. They tend to give laxative effects, and this is why we use them in small amounts and things like gum. Usually people aren't chewing an entire package of gum. I'm not even sure if an entire package of gum is enough to give you laxative effects, but that's kind of the big thing. And so runny stool and extra gas and bloating and those kind of things can be kind of the big problem. So if you see sugar alcohols in something, it's not bad for you, but some people are making the claim that they are. And actually the research shows they're really minimal health effects other than the laxative part. Let's talk about these other artificial sweeteners, and there's a whole bunch of them out there. And a lot of people have strong feelings about artificial sweeteners. If you're looking for a really good, thorough podcast on this kind of thing, check out the link I have down here, Gastropod. They do a very good kind of history and talk about some of the science of these sweeteners. And, a lot of people don't know that lead was actually the first artificial sweetener. It was used by the Romans. Lead apparently is sweet. That's why it's a big concern when there's lead in paint, because of course kids might eat the paint if it's sweet. And lead, we know now, is a toxic metal. You do not want to be eating lead. Not a good idea. So what does the research show on artificial sweeteners? Believe it or not, more rats have been fed these things than you would possibly imagine. In terms of chemicals, these things have been tested more than almost anything on the planet. It's actually incredible the number of studies done on aspartame and other artificial sweeteners. Depending on the sweetener, they're mostly or can be calorie-free. They don't contribute to dental disease. And all of these chemicals are exactly that. They're different chemicals. Some of them are toxic if consumed in high doses, and we've done that with rats. And the doses that they're feeding rats is so high, it's almost unrealistic to think about humans consuming that much. There's all sorts of compounds that we consume on a daily basis that if we had in high amounts would cause us all sorts of toxic effects. And these are the ones that are often cited by people who are against artificial sweeteners, not understanding that the concentrations are completely unrealistic. There may be other physiological effects, and I'll play a video here for you in a moment about diet sodas here in a moment, because there are some things that we don't understand, and there are effects on some people consume a lot of it. Every once in a while, you hear about somebody and they're drinking 8 diet colas a day, and anything you're consuming in large amounts, it's going to have effects on your body, whether it's physiologically or psychologically and whatnot. But this is kind of the big note to say about these, is that they are all different chemical substances. And this is a problem with some of the studies, is they just talk about artificial sweeteners, but they're using different ones, and you have to treat each chemical as different because some of them might affect the liver, some of them might affect the brain, and they're going to have different effects on the body. So I've got a video here I will play for you in a moment that kind of talks about some of the effects, and then I'll comment on it afterwards. I just want to introduce you just to some of the artificial sweeteners that you may have seen out there. Aspartame is one of the old ones. So I think NutraSweet, it was one of the originals. There's also Equal. They're usually found in the little blue packets. Apparently 200 times more sweeter than sucrose, and sweetness lasts a long time. So a lot of people don't like aspartame because it has a weird, like a longer aftertaste that seems unnatural. You can't cook it, so it's not good for every necessarily product. Saccharin is another one, also been around a long time, found in the little pink packets, and apparently that has a metallic aftertaste. I haven't really sat down and tried these all side by side to tell you what I think about them. Sucralose is a slightly newer one, also known as Splenda. It's one of the name brands of it. And this is made from sucrose, and notice it has no aftertaste and it's heat stable. So this one tends to be quite popular in certain products that you find out there because of that. The heat stableness can manage being cooked. A little cartoon here about sucralose. If you take a look at the top here, here's sucrose on the left. Remember, our carbohydrates have all these alcohol groups. So what they've done is they've taken the alcohol groups and they've added some chlorides on there. And I guess that makes it so our body can't digest it, but it still tastes sweet. There's a little cartoon. You can see the guy is, he's a lab. He's got a beaker and he's mixing. He says, "Here, try this coffee." And he says, "What did you put in it?" "Oh, it's just sugar, which I chemically modified by adding chlorine atoms in the presence of toluene and wood alcohol." And the guy spits it out and says, "Blah, are you crazy? I just drank chlorinated sugar." And he says, "Chlorinated sugar is an unsavory description. What if we just called it Splenda?" And the guy says, "Well, that's a better name. It's delicious. Give me more." So cute little cartoon there. And one that is a little bit newer on the market is called Stevia. I saw a Stevia Coca-Cola in a green can a while ago. And this is a natural product from plant. And so it's really getting a high marketing because it's a natural product, of course, and many people just assume that natural is safer than artificial, and that's not necessarily the case, but it's getting a good marketing push because of that. So like I said, remember, these are all different chemicals. There's a lot of debate over these, and lots of rats have been fed these things, and to show that at least in moderate quantities, they seem to be very safe chemicals. It's the higher quantities that we're more concerned about. So this is for the fitness chef, and he is a big proponent of enjoying diet sodas once in a while, and because of just reducing the amount of added sugar and then reducing the added calories. And he's trying to dispel some myths, right? You can see there's a myth about aspartame causing you cancer, and it will cause rats cancer when they're fed something like 10 times the amount a normal human would ever have in a day. It can cause cancer. And again, these are rats. Rats like to get cancer much easier than humans. Is it tricking your brain? There's a little bit of debate about that kind of research and whatnot. And again, like I said, he's trying to kind of dispel some myths in that, you know what, you can enjoy a Diet Cola. Try to ignore the pseudoscience because these things are not bad. In fact, for some people, this is a strategy for losing weight. If they're going to replace calories and replace sugars with these things, it's actually a good thing. They may taste terrible, but for some people, this is a strategy. And diabetics, some of them have no choice. If you want to enjoy a soda, you have to have the diet one because you don't want to increase your blood glucose levels. So here's the video I was going to play for you. It says, what do artificial sweeteners actually do to your body? So let me play that now for you, and I'll comment on it a little bit afterwards about some of the things that he or she says.
Apparently, no calories does not equal no consequences, and artificial sweeteners like the kind you may find in diet drinks may be just as bad for you as sugar, with your brain and your gut responding in surprising ways to that delicious synthetic sweetness. The FDA has approved 6 artificial sweeteners as a low-calorie or no-calorie option to help us curb things like obesity. So they're not sugar, but studies have shown that your body may still be reacting to them negatively. How is it processing these seemingly magical compounds? And the main theories come down to your brain and your gut. Multiple studies have shown that sustained artificial sweetener use can induce insulin resistance, and this probably involves your brain. It could be that when your tongue tastes something sweet, your brain is expecting the physical presence of sugar and tells your pancreas to start producing insulin, which lets your body absorb the sugar. Only when there's no sugar to absorb, you still have the insulin in your body. Repeating this process every time you drink a diet soda could lead to insulin buildup with no place for it to go, and then systemic insulin resistance, which is the precursor to diabetes. Turns out we can't just turn our brains off. It's just trying to do its job, guys. Artificial sweeteners are anywhere between 200 to 20,000 times sweeter than table sugar. And aside from the insulin issue, we're still unsure on how our taste receptors process these substitutes. Science does suggest, however, that your brain can distinguish between the two. It knows when you're eating real sugar, and even though it still releases insulin in response to artificial sweeteners, they light up a different neural reward pathway than real sugar. So at the same time that we're exposing our taste receptors to extremely, intensely sweet-tasting foods, our brain isn't getting a true sugar high. These factors lead some experts to say that we're training our palate to crave sweeter and sweeter things while our brain still isn't receiving true sugar satisfaction. So we're just exacerbating a sugar craving, not treating it. But it's not just our brains. It could be our guts too, because microbes, or at least a little bit. These faux sugars aren't digestible, hence no calories. You literally just poop them out. But that means that those molecules are kind of just hanging around in your intestines with certain microbes that can digest them. Those microbes can then trigger a glucose response, leading to, you guessed it, insulin resistance. A changed gut microbiome in response to artificial sweetener use could also produce hormonal changes in your body, quite possibly a hormone that influences your appetite, and not in the good way. The researchers are careful to say, though, that everyone's microbiome is different, so the severity of these effects definitely vary from person to person, and experts advocate a personalized approach to nutritional and medicinal recommendations in this area. And on top of all of this, those who regularly use artificial sweeteners may start to find healthy foods, even naturally sweet ones like fruit, unpalatable because they're so used to a more intense taste. Faux sugar may help some Diet Cola lovers justify consuming extra calories that they wouldn't otherwise because they just drank something with 0 calories. And artificial sweeteners may prevent us from associating a sweet taste with weight gain, training our brain to think that we can eat whatever we want with no repercussions. These are only the beginning of the ways that artificial sweeteners may be actually contributing to the very epidemic that they were supposed to help fight: obesity, diabetes, and other weight-related diseases. So that's kind of nuts. We're trying to bypass our body's natural mechanism so we can eat super sweet stuff with nothing bad happening, but it looks like nature's not gonna let us get away with that. That information is a little tough to swallow, but rest assured that we here at Seeker will always keep your science craving satisfied, so subscribe so you can always decide what not to drink. And check out my other video about how your gut controls your brain. Fun fact, the first artificial sweetener was discovered in a lab accident. The scientist spilled a food preservative on his hands and then forgot to wash them before lunch. And spoiler, it was sweet. I'm Marin. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so she touched on a lot of the things I wanted to talk about, but like I said, there's been tons and tons of studies done on artificial sweeteners, and we're still trying to understand what is really going on in the brain. Some of the studies show that people who choose to consume artificial sugars are still consuming more normal sugars. So, they're not substituting the artificial sugar for regular sugar. They're actually just consuming both. So obviously that's not helping with people's sugar intake. Lots of studies on rats that show that it might stimulate appetite. Lots of studies in humans showing kind of mixed results. In some people that these artificial sugars can stimulate appetite, and some studies show that they don't. Again, each of these chemicals has to be treated as differently because the more likely story is that each of these artificial sweeteners has different effects on the brain and on the body. And as she said, the microbiome as well. So don't vilify artificial sugars, just don't eat too many of them, right? Enjoy them once in a while, enjoy life, but try not to overconsume these things, because definitely, like anything in nutrition, people who overconsume any one thing tend to cause problems for their body. Okay, so what about eating carbohydrates around exercise? These are the general recommendations around exercise, and exercise can mean both cardio and muscular exercise. Generally, pre-exercise, meaning an hour or two before, you want to eat carbohydrates, right? Usually starchy foods, not too much fiber, not too much protein. Again, if you're doing weights, you might want to have the protein in there, but you want easily digestible protein. So protein shakes and things like that might be better than having, say, a bunch of eggs. And this is a common misconception. A lot of people, I especially notice with coaching kids, they have a game and in the morning the parent thinks protein is good and they want to feed them a bunch of eggs, and that's not what you want to do. These things are going to sit in the stomach and take too long to digest. What you want is starch that will break down at a regular rate and provide them with fuel for the entire exercise or game or whatever it's going to be. That's what you're looking at. During the exercise, usually you're going to avoid eating. If you're hungry during exercise, eat something that digests really easily. So a candy bar may actually be ideal during exercise. Gives you some quick energy. Finish doing your reps or finish doing your laps or whatever, or it could be a granola bar, something like that. Generally drink water and try not to drink too much of it. Some people get stomach aches. So generally the idea is to sip or guzzle. Sip, do not guzzle is what you're looking at. And notice it doesn't, what does it say about sports drinks? For the most part, avoid sports drinks unless your activity is an hour or more, is the general recommendation. And we'll talk about sports drinks in a couple of units when we talk about electrolytes and whatnot. But generally, water is the best. And you don't need the sugar, you don't need the electrolytes unless you're working out for longer than an hour. And actually, most people recommend 90 minutes or more. Post-exercise, it's usually a good idea to eat soon to replenish some of the glycogen that your muscles have lost. And if you're working out, include protein, and that will help to rebuild your muscle. A little bit of fat as well will help you digest things at a moderate rate. And that's kind of usually the recommendation. So here's some graphics. You can see the pre-exercise, potatoes, bagels, apples, fruit, those kind of things. During exercise, drink your water longer than an hour, maybe a sports drink or a sports gel if you feel that you're losing electrolytes after a proper meal. The focus on carbohydrates with a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat in there. So this is the end of our carbohydrate unit. So that means that quiz number 4 will be due in 1 week. All right, thank you for listening. We will see you in class.